I'd like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to speak. It's a pleasure and an honor to address my colleagues on the question of methods in the social sciences. Now, my specific topic, vicissitudes of methods, is chosen for me by the nature of the conference itself. One cannot help but wonder how we can believe that social science is scientific, given the cacophony of methods that are discussed at some point during these pleasant days in the Charwater Meadows. Critical reading, longitudinal data analysis, lyrical sociology, data mining, field experiments, biomarkers. Can anyone possibly imagine that there is some one thing that this conference is about? Now, of course, I've done my own share of muddying the methodological waters. I've published literary analyse de texte, but I've also introduced sociology to data mining with sequencing algorithms. I've published pieces awash with archival footnotes, but I was also among the first sociologists to talk about Monte Carlo Markov chain methods. I'm responsible for neologisms like lyrical sociology, but I edit a journal heavily laden with simulation, network analysis, and hierarchical linear models. So my task today is to try to make sense of the seeming methodological chaos in my own life, as well as across our disciplines. Now, the obvious answer involves interdisciplinarity and reciprocal stimulation and all that. I'm sure you can all recite this line of argument without the slightest difficulty. If we would only get out of our bunkers and foxholes and silos and visit other people's bunkers and foxholes and silos, our minds would be broadened and the scholarly millennium would arrive. In practice, of course, these interdisciplinary adventures tend to result in mutual incomprehension or a focus on practical output rather than theoretical and intellectual consistency. No, the real problem is that we all know already that it's sometimes useful to borrow methods from others. What we don't know is when to do that and how much to do that. But knowing this requires some reflection about the corporate knowledge enterprise in which we are all collectively engaged. For as social scientists, we want not only the success of our own little paradigms and methodological communities, but also of our disciplines and even of social science as a whole. But we don't really have much idea what it is that we want our disciplines and social science more broadly to accomplish. Sorry, these glasses, it's far away. When we do actually reflect about knowledge across our disciplines of the social sciences, we mutter some pious thoughts about cumulativity and then quickly rush back to run another regression or read another field note. Now, few of us actually believe in a tightly cumulative model of social science, either in theory or in practice. As I've shown elsewhere, there's very little evidence for cumulativity in the social sciences. We cite articles that are positively ancient by natural science standards. We perpetually redefine our data and data codings in a way that prevent truly cumulative work. And we reject old methods for new ones at a truly alarming rate. But we have not faced up to the implications of our disbelief in cumulativity. For once the idea of cumulativity is given up, none of us has much idea how to envision, much less create, good trajectories for knowledge of social life. And we need to know how to do that if we're going to make wise decisions about when we ought to borrow methods from each other. In this paper, then, I shall discuss possible knowledge ideals for a world in which there is extreme methodological pluralism and where cumulativity seems to have failed as an overall ideal, even though it thrives as an ideal local to certain areas of the methodological space. I begin by sketching a general analysis of how modern knowledge evolves in the humanities and the social sciences. I then turn to methodological differences in particular, considering some possible sources and implications of those differences. And finally, I discuss various models for encounters between different methodological communities. So I begin with a general analysis of the evolution of knowledge in the modern university sector. Within this academic knowledge, we see many different kinds of knowing. Put another way, knowing has many and varying attributes: level of detail, basic assumptions, typical objects, preference for one mode of knowing over another, narrative over analysis. This multiplicity is not necessarily inherent in the social world itself, but it is inherent in the project of knowing, which seems to aim at such multiplicity. Now, the multiplicity of knowing means that no one can know everything. This conclusion follows for three reasons. First, many modes of knowing are in fact contradictory. Extreme abstraction versus extreme concreteness, for example. Such contradiction means that these knowings cannot be entertained at one time. In the context of sociology and the larger social sciences, this means that you can't simultaneously be an expert on hierarchical linear models and a first-class ethnographer. You can't simultaneously be a metropolitan sociologist and a subaltern sociologist. Indeed, you can't simultaneously be an anthropologist and an economist. Of course, you can try to do both things, but the prices are very, very high. Another reason no one can know everything is that the sheer number of ways of knowing rises combinatorically with the number of attributes of knowing and their values. Given that there are at least a dozen possible attributes of knowing, each with anywhere from 2 to dozens of values, the number of possible ways of knowing is very large indeed. And not only can one not know everything, but also, because of this, the vast majority of possible types of social knowing have never been tried. Finally, no one can know everything because, given that it is human to think up new ways to know things, new attributes are always emerging for knowing. For example, it's recently been decided by many colleagues that women's knowledge is different from men's knowledge, and consequently that all of social science needs to be reinvented from the feminist point of view. No sociologist in the 1940s, male or female, would have imagined that this whole new range of knowledge existed. If they were brought back to life today, they would think feminist sociology consisted of new facts, reinventions of the theoretical wheel, and political argument inappropriate in the social science. But we simply find it a new way to know. Such new forms of knowing are constantly invented, or at least proposed. For all these reasons, it follows that no one can know everything. I should call this fact the limitation of knowing. Note that the fact of limitation obtains not only for individuals, but even for groups of humans and for objects, like computers. Limitation cannot be solved by simple increase of intellectual horsepower. In the main, it is the mutually contradictory nature of certain forms of knowing, my first reason, that guarantees this limitation. But limitation also follows from the combinatoric quality of knowing. For each new form of knowing can be hybridized with old forms, so each time a new form emerges, it produces not only itself, but also a whole new generation of hybrids, which can in turn be hybridized, and so on. The more we know, therefore, the worse the problem of limitation becomes. One important consequence of limitation is that the project of creating a universal knowledge, or even a universal measure for human knowledge, whether in terms of numbers of articles or amounts of ideas, etc., is doomed. Only finite subsets of human knowledge can be known. It follows that in practice there will be subgroups of knowing. These don't have to be consistent or exhaustive or anything other than random, but if there is organization of knowing, it must take the form of somewhat independent subgroupings. There is not and cannot be a single grand knowledge. In practice, as we all know, academic knowing typically happens in what we usually call disciplines, lineage groups of scholars who act as common audiences for each other over time. However, since the word discipline suggests both stasis and a certain kind of negativism, I shall often refer to these lineage groups as knowledge lineages instead. Note that my argument so far applies at varying levels. It applies to the larger lineages beyond what are usually called the disciplines, science versus the humanities, just as easily as it applies to the traditional disciplinary lineages themselves, sociology versus economics, and to the sublineages within them, STS versus SSK, political opportunity structures versus cultural opportunity structures, and so on. Indeed, it can also apply to differences between national instantiations of a given form of knowing. Now, it's empirically obvious that there are strong continuities in knowledge lineages over time. They seem to specialize in particular attributes of knowing. They tend to prefer particular levels of detail, basic assumptions, typical objects, one mode of knowing rather than another, say positivism over interpretation. And of course, these things change gradually over time in any lineage, but at any given time, for any particular lineage, we can discern a current set of objects, assumptions, modes, and so on that may be called its architecture of knowing, remembering always that this architecture can and does change. This concept of architecture is obviously cognate with Thomas Kuhn's term paradigm, but the differences in my analysis make the new term useful. Now, the specialization of knowledge lineages in particular architectures of knowing, together with the huge variety of theoretically possible architectures and the mutually contradictory quality of many of those possibilities, means that there's almost no likelihood that the various forms of knowledge taken as a sum or somehow put together could be made into an ensemble that somehow adds up to or combines into or makes an encyclopedic knowledge of everything. The dream of the philosophes is impossible. Note that a side implication of this is that the old saw about Leibniz being the last person who knew everything is ridiculous. No one ever knew everything. The idea of a single person knowing everything makes sense only if we assume a hierarchical structure to knowledge, and it's clear that we cannot do that, at least for the kind of knowledge that we seem to be developing. The Leibniz example, however, reminds us of one final point about knowledge lineages. They are, to some extent, lineages constituted of actual people. Under modern conditions, most knowledge systems and knowledge phenomena last for a shorter time than does a human life, or even a 40-year human career. Physics may outlast an individual career, but string theory has not yet done so, nor has hierarchical linear modeling, nor practice theory, and so on. To the extent that knowledge work is concentrated in individuals as a type of expertise, a calling, or a life work, then knowledge has a social structure, not merely a cultural one. It's not just a symbolic phenomenon, but also a social, behavioral, even a physical one. Now, so far I've established two basic ideas. First, expert knowing has many and sometimes contradictory attributes. All knowing is particular, and conversely, no one can know everything, in part because of the contradiction between ways of knowing, in part because of the sheer multiplicity of things that could be known. Second, as a result of this limitation, as I've called it, expert knowing happens in knowledge lineages, each of which is characterized by a limited set of knowledge attributes, which I've called an architecture, and each is loosely associated with a group of individuals. The question immediately arises, how do these lineages relate to one another? Now, the lineages of interest here today are methodologies, and our immediate question is how different methodological communities might relate to one another. To understand this, however, requires that we undertake two further steps in my general analysis. The first concerns general models for this relation, and the insufficiency of those models will then force us to elaborate new and more local models for lineage development. I'll argue that within methodological communities, as within all knowledge lineages, there emerge fashions that have typical life cycles. And the balance of forces driving these cycles in any particular case will determine when and where borrowing from someone else is a good thing. In my discussion, I'll be replacing the very abstract and theoretical analysis given so far with a much more concrete theoretical framework applicable to the actual methodological communities that we observe. Now, in the normative theory of knowledge, as well as in practice, there seem to be two generic views for the relation between sublineages. The first general scheme is canonization, the scheme characteristic of the humanities for the first 3/4 of the 20th century. Canonization creates a hierarchy and then directs all attention to the top of the hierarchy. In the first instance, canonization is a drastic strategy for reduction of excessive data. There's too much English literature to read, so we canonize Shakespeare ahead of Marlowe, Webster, Turner, and company, or Jane Austen ahead of Fanny Burney, Elizabeth Gaskell, and company, and so on and on. Closer to home, there are too many social theorists to read, so we canonize Marx, Weber, and Durkheim and read only those people. Canonization even works to a certain extent in methodology, although generally at the level of disciplines. A good example here is the use of instrumental variables, which is quite part of the methodological canon in economics, but regarded as worthless in most of sociology. Under canonization, the relation between disparate groups with their different canons becomes very, very difficult. Canonization strongly reduces internal diversity and inevitably leads, by Zimelian forces, to more explicit difference between groupings. By contrast, internal diversity increases the possibility that external groups may be useful allies in internal debates, and internal unclarity increases the possibility that external views may randomly seem relevant. This is particularly the case when internal differences fractally replicate external ones, as we see quite commonly. Yet even sharing canonical writers may not help. American sociologists and anthropologists both take Durkheim to be canonical, but the former read The Division of Labor and Suicide, while the latter read The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. The other problem with canonization, both with canonization as practical strategy and with canonization as an analytic concept, is that canons tend to be static. The most common evolution of a canon is specialization, as we saw in mid-20th century literary studies, where expertise in 19th century fiction gave way to expertise in Jane Austen and ultimately to expertise in Mansfield Park. An obvious example from the world of methods would be the focus of American sociological methods on linear modeling to the total exclusion of pattern search methods like clustering and scaling. American sociology has far more to gain from a move towards pattern search, but in practice, what we observe is ever-increasing complexity of linear modeling, the use of splines, dummy variables, strong assumptions, and so on, to handle problems that would actually be much better handled by a complete change of methodological approach. The use of case-level fixed effects to handle the failures of longitudinal data arrays to meet the assumptions necessary for statistical estimation is another such defensive specialization. But canonization is only one of the basic strategies determining interrelations between different knowledge lineages. The other is subsumption, the notion that some version of knowledges are really simply subdivisions of others. Now, the concept of subsumption presumes that all real knowledge is of one kind, and therefore that the different architectures of knowing described earlier can be nested within one another in hierarchies from specific to general. The apparent contradictions between them are taken to reflect mere practical limitations. Thus, it might be argued that we do ethnography only because we haven't yet mastered real-time attitude measurement, or because we mistake random variation in behavior for significant difference, and so on. There is no contradiction in principle on this view between the kind of knowledge generated by ethnography and that generated by questionnaires, films, recordings, and so on. The one method is simply a temporary expedient for the other. Obviously, the idea of subsumption provides only limited help in thinking about relations between varying lineages of methodology. It does appear to account for the emergence of some generalized methods, like Leo Goodman's deep demonstration of the mathematical unity of correspondence analysis and log linear modeling, for example. It comprehends things like hierarchical linear modeling, where single-level modeling becomes a special case of that more general procedure. But it doesn't do much for understanding the relations between the 100 methodologies of microsociology: affect control theory, ethnomethodology, symbolic interaction, extended case method, and so on. And above all, it too is ultimately static. Anything that lies off the track of the gradually emerging subsumptive hierarchy simply disappears from our comprehension. In terms of my original abstract analysis, then, we found that the two standard models that relate evolving knowledge lineages over time, canonization and subsumption, simply don't comprehend most of what goes on in the lineages we observe. But this failure is not merely empirical, it's also normative. Neither concept can function as a very effective ideal any more than it can function as a description, because both are limited and both are static. Now, to create a more effective framework for considering the evolution and interrelation of knowledge lineages over time requires that I turn aside for a second and provide a more careful analysis of cumulation. In particular, we must look at what seems to cumulate and what does not. My analysis here turns on three forms of what I should call knowledge relations. By the phrase knowledge relation, I mean a relation between what is to be known and the means of knowing. In the first form of knowledge relation, knowing seems unproblematic, and emphasis falls on the known. Without much intervention by the knower and without any controversy about types of knowing, the world that is knowable here just turns into known things. In honor of the great positivist historian Leopold von Ranke, I shall call this form of transformation Rankian knowledge, and the things so known Rankian facts. These are things like the date of Juan Facundo Quiroga's assassination, or the population of Hong Kong in 1903, or the number of languages spoken by at least one inhabitant of Cluj. Of course, any one of those things can be multiply unpacked and reinterpreted, but the fact remains that relative to most other kinds of knowledge, these are uncontroversial. From the point of view of cumulation, Rankian facts simply pile up unproblematically, like sediments in a river delta. Now, the second version of knowledge relation involves complexities in both the knowing and the known. I shall call it colligation. We have mid-sized assemblages of facts, usually produced in the light of some theory and embodying that theory. An example might be the famous father-son mobility table with its 3 social classes for fathers, 3 social classes for son, and the 9 probabilities of transition of class status from father to son. Another example might be the structuralist analysis of myth elaborated by Lévi-Strauss. Unlike Rankian knowledge, colligation doesn't really involve simple input and output. The objects of knowing in colligation are not treated as if they existed ex ante, like Rankian facts. Rather, colligation is the combination of very loosely conceived objects of knowing with very specific ways of knowing to produce definite pictures of what is really there in the social world. These hypothetical things, colligations, are then taken to be the actual nature of the social world. But they are in practice inseparable mixtures of things known and ways of knowing. Now, colligations do not simply pile up like sediments on the river bottom. On the contrary, they seem to be elaborated for a while and then get set aside. The father-son social class transition table disappeared in the 1970s, done in by the new way of analyzing mobility that was implicit in Blau and Duncan's famous book on the American occupational structure. Analysts now looked at occupational life and saw a new set of facts related not to the generational transition of father to son, but to the specific contribution made to specific job successes by a specific aspect of parental status, father's prior occupation. In this new colligation, the Markovian character of social class mobility disappeared completely behind the much more individualized analysis of marginal occupational status. Quite literally, the facts that analysts saw in the occupational world were newly invented facts. Thus, colligations seem to accumulate for a while, but then they get replaced. Now, the third version of knowledge relation concerns extremely general habits of thinking about the world, treating the social world as comprising individuals and their relations, or treating it as mainly symbolic. I shall call this categorical knowledge, for it is analogous to the categories of logic. If you approach the world symbolically or atomistically, you will literally not see anything that does not fit into your approach. This kind of knowledge relation doesn't seem to have much of anything to do with the known at all. It's all about knowing. As for accumulation, this categorical world never seems to change very much. So there are 3 different kinds of knowledge relations, each of which involves a different relation between knowing and the known. In the traditional language of epistemology, Rankian knowledge is realist, categorical knowledge is idealist, and colligation is a mixture of the two. It's obvious that all 3 are going on in the social sciences all the time. It is also obvious that while Rankian knowledge accumulates relatively unproblematically, mid-range colligations seem to build to a certain size, but then collapse. You can build a picture of World War I, for example, but ultimately that picture starts involving so many parts that it starts to break down, and you have to colligate subparts like military operations and the home front and morale. But these different subparts may lend themselves better to some architectures of knowing than to others, and as a result, the coherence of the original colligation of the war itself begins to falter. As for categorical thinking, my third level, it never changes much, although the kinds of people who choose a particular set of categories may, of course, change from time to time. So we have cumulation, limited cumulation, and stability for the 3 forms of knowledge relation. By distinguishing the 3 levels, we can see that the common sense concept of cumulation really applies only at the middle level to colligations. The Rankian facts, they pile up like stuff on the river bottom. We don't care. That's not really of interest to us. We're interested in the stuff in the middle, which appears to really grow. We observe clearly that colligations evolve and accumulate quite steadily and then gradually seem to fall apart. Status attainment theory or new social movement theory are obvious examples. Both could be seen as Kuhnian paradigms with a typical colligation of the world, a set of attached methods, a set of common questions, and so on. In both cases, all of these attributes of the knowledge architecture, colligation, methods, questions, co-evolved over time, but eventually both of these examples broke down, not so much under the weight of anomalies as they would have in the Kuhnian account, but under the constraints made by the assumptions and stylizations that had been necessary in the beginning to build the evolving colligation. Once those assumptions and stylizations had to be applied to new kinds of facts that didn't fit them very well. Because the mechanisms that govern colligations in part determining when borrowing is useful, I'm going to get to borrowing being useful eventually, we need to specify those forces very carefully. The forces are of two kinds, some of which make colligations more internally coherent, perhaps even rigid, others of which make them less so. It's the former that get new colligations started by identifying the incentives and intellectual advantages that come with colligation creation, but those very advantages ultimately allow the disorganizing forces to have a greater effect as time passes. This succession guarantees that all knowledge projects have finite duration, at least under a given architecture of knowing. It also means that colligations have characteristic trajectories, and that the utility of borrowing, both from the point of view of the individual colligation and its community, and from the point of view of the social sciences as a whole, will be decided in terms of the balance of forces at particular moments in those trajectories. So let me begin with the forces that make for coherence and rigidity within evolving colligations. First of all, knowledge lineages tend to rationalize or systematize their knowledge over time. This comes in part from the imperatives of teaching new generations, but may also reflect ideologies about the importance of logic or systematization. To the extent that canonization is active, that process also may produce this effect. Second, cultural structures like discourses and physical structures like libraries and laboratories tend to encode architectures of knowing in ways that create stability without the intervention of the actual knowers. The identification and use of canonical works, the purchase of multiple copies of things, setups of library classification, and so on. Often these structures are initially imposed simply because the possibilities of knowledge are so abundant that intensive restriction was necessary for any form of communication to arise, as I noted earlier in the case of sociological theory being defined into just being Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. Third, temporary expedients harden. Thus, deconstructionism originated as a way of opening up constipated humanities fields, but then continued simply as an agent of destruction. Or again, early tentative statistical assumptions or measurement strategies become factitious because they provide at least a conventional basis for research. What was tried temporarily, a great example is Duncan's path analysis, hardens into an accepted and canonical procedure because no one's willing to forego the results, even though those were initially and quite correctly seen to be tentative and questionable. Duncan knew the whole thing had feet of clay. Opposed to these forces of coherence and rigidification are other forces which undermine them. First of all, demographic forces provide continuous undermining. Young, low-status scholars have very high incentives for borrowing, stealing, and translating from the outside. Did some of that myself. Also, young scholars learn only the new theories and the new theorists because their teachers tend to forget to teach what they knew for granted and teach only the new materials. Moreover, the ideology of progress forces scholars to create the appearance of change even when there is no real change, which, given the actual stability of categorical knowledge, produces very confusing results. As a result of all this, simple categorical truths are renamed with great regularity, but then the stability of the underlying truths tends to bend the new uses of terms. All of this undermines coherence. Second, in the more scientific social sciences, rationalization leads to very clear expectations, which in turn defines clear anomalies, which in turn can lead to renewal à la Kuhn. In the humanistic social sciences, there are no really clear anomalies, and indeed anomalous status is claimed fairly often. But there may be a kind of meta-Kuhn process by which anomalous anomalies pile up, leading to new methods for the production of more routine anomalies. More typically, in the humanistic social sciences, the intensive pursuit of novelty ultimately subdivides a successful paradigm once its core topics are exhausted, as I noted earlier about Jane Austen. Third, often new colligations start with rash, simplified assumptions. Initial results rely on this artificial clarity. As the assumptions are relaxed and complexity creeps back in, the paradigm suddenly looks much more tentative and fuzzy. In the long run, most mature quantitative literatures come to look alike in terms of variables. They just approach the same mass of variables and relations in slightly different ways. choosing different variables to be dependent, making slightly different mathematical assumptions, and so on. Fourth, and perhaps most important, as evolving colligations get more effective, they get more ambitious. They seek to embrace a broader range of Rankian facts, often turning for that purpose to facts that were not in fact part of the original colligation and that may fit it very badly indeed. The more so because the colligation has now been rationalized, systematized, and perfected. This challenge may be handled by attempts to relax the underlying assumptions and the rationalization, but that just leads to the spiral I've just discussed, whereby the colligation loses its specificity and power. Thus, there are forces pushing for coherence of an evolving colligation, as well as forces pushing against that coherence. Reflection suggests that the forces of coherence have no opposition at the beginning, and hence they dominate the initial development of a colligation. The more they're successful, however, the stronger will be the bite of the forces of incoherence when those eventually arise. Thus, the central implication of this analysis is that any discipline, paradigm, or project of knowledge is inherently self-limited. As it becomes a best version of itself, its insufficiency becomes increasingly clear, and it must begin to turn outward in an attempt to renew itself, or must wither into self-regarding irrelevance. This turning undercuts the clarity and coherence of its architecture of knowing. Now, such a pattern inevitably associates projects with particular generations of scholars. I shall use the phrase generational paradigm to refer to the combination of an evolving colligation and a group of scholars who are associated with that colligation, typically a generation or cohort. It takes only a few minutes of reflection to realize that the histories of sociology and the other social sciences are littered with generational paradigms, from the new social history of the early 1900s to the new social movements theory of 1980s and beyond. Generational paradigms seem to last about 20 to 40 years, which underscores the importance of the connection with a particular cohort of scholars. In particular, most of the methodological lineages that we see represented at this conference are in fact generational paradigms, whether they're quantitative or qualitative, formal or informal, theoretically founded or utterly ad hoc. And the question of how and when we should borrow from each other involves relation between these moving and changing entities, not between fixed bunkers and silos, which have in fact never existed anywhere. It's for that reason that I've spent 2/3 of my time sketching a general theory of the evolution of knowledge lineages. So I've now established the general dynamics of knowledge lineages, which I've concretized into this more practical concept of generational paradigms. By doing so, I've avoided the stasis that's implicit in canonization and subsumption as general approaches to the relation of the various subunits of bodies of knowledge. We've seen that generational paradigms have life cycles, and it should be becoming obvious that borrowing from other generational paradigms is a function of those life cycles, becoming increasingly necessary as the forces of destruction begin to unwind the initial advantages of a particular generational paradigm. However, there are two quite different criteria for that borrowing. The first concerns the advantages of borrowing for a particular generational paradigm itself. Will the borrowing rejuvenate it? Will it confuse it? Will borrowing lead to desertion by current enthusiasts, or perhaps by invasions by those whose methods have been borrowed, as we see today in the invasion of social science network analysis by computer scientists and physicists who have no understanding whatsoever of social data? By contrast, so that's the first thing. What does it do for the paradigm? By contrast, the second criterion concerns the health of the system of paradigms as a whole for the project of all social science. This is a quite different matter. Under the canonization and subsumption models, the health of the system is guaranteed by the health of the pieces within it. Improvements in pieces are inevitably passed up the canonical or inductive hierarchies by minor shifts in the patterns of canons or of the order and extent of the subsumptions. But once we begin to envision the social sciences as a mass of quite loosely linked generational paradigms, some of them early in their life cycles, others in full flower, others in decline, it is not clear what impact a particular act of borrowing will have on the system as a whole. It's no longer the case that the disappearance of any particular version of social science is a loss that will invalidate a whole range of knowledge dependent on it. The model I've given implies continuous rediscovery. It therefore requires a different set of ideals than those associated with traditional accumulation. We must consider those ideals first because in some sense it is the ideals for the system as a whole that ought to govern the evolution of the individual paradigms. I'm going to specify those ideals in terms of a space of possible knowledges, just as we would specify the ideals of accumulation in terms of the height and extent of some knowledge structure. In my view, that possibility space is defined by what I called a few minutes ago the categories of social thinking. As I said, these are more or less stable ways to see the social world as process, as conflict, as symbols, as individual acts, so on. Along with the various attributes that constitute knowledge architecture, these categories span a space of possible ways to think about the social process. They define the range of possibilities. Now, one possible knowledge ideal for social science as a whole is that no zone of that possibility space should disappear from our current repertoire of knowing for very long. In formal terms, we ask for an upper bound on the mean recurrence time for any substantial zone of that space. We don't want individualist accounts to so dominate that there are no structural or corporate ones for more than, say, a decade. We don't want symbolic interpretations to become so dominant that social structure disappears completely from the social science agenda for too long. We don't want survey analysis to triumph so completely that we stop doing the qualitative studies of attitudes that remind us that survey analysis has feet of clay. Now, one reason for a bounded recurrence criterion is the fact that every substantial area of the space of possible social sciences can mount a devastating critique of all other areas, as I showed at length in the book Methods of Discovery. These critiques work by privileging different attributes within the architecture of knowing, and they mean that the space of possible social sciences is cyclical rather than linearly ordered as under the canonization and subsumption models. Knowledge ideals for a cyclical space must of necessity be quite different from ideals for a hierarchical ordered space, and bounded recurrence is one such ideal. Another criterion for a non-cumulative knowledge process, less easy to specify in formal terms, is what I'm going to call plenitude. By plenitude, I mean that we want a knowledge process that will effectively fill the space of possible knowledges of the social world. A trivial way of imagining that is to think that we would like ultimately to investigate all possible ways of knowing, in the sense of visiting all possible combinations of all possible attributes of knowing. Ethnographic narrative positivism, quantitative lyrical conflict-based prosopography, and so on. But this is a static conception, and it presupposes that we already know all possible dimensions of attributes, and that all are invoked at any given time. In practice, we can't see all possible attributes at once, and we can usually only imagine new forms of knowledge that are one or two steps away from where we are. But plenitude should include the possibility of making up whole new dimensions of difference, or of eradicating old ones. However, at any given time, we clearly should aim for maximum current plenitude in social science. So, for example, it's a good thing that today's economists are reinventing experimental psychology. Not because, as the economists might say, the psychologists didn't do it right, and thank goodness we're now here to show them how to do it with real mathematics, which would be the cumulative way to think about it, or because doing social psychological experiments will revolutionize economics, probably won't, but because somebody needs to be doing this kind of thing, and the research front of psychology itself has in fact gone biological for the moment, leaving this whole area of experimental research approaches to behavior quite underserved in the world of social science. Meanwhile, of course, the sociologists and political scientists have taken up large-scale punditry about the economy, since the economists became so mathematical that philosophical reflection about economic life has nearly disappeared from their discipline. In both cases, what appear to be reduplications and reinventions are actually part of maintaining at any given time the plenitude of the social sciences as comprehensive ways of thinking about the world. A little reflection will persuade you that, thus stated, the plenitude criterion is not that much different from the bounded recurrence criterion. But if we remove from that criterion the idea that we in some sense know ahead of time all possible attributes and dimensions of knowledge, then plenitude becomes the quite dynamic criterion that we expect the array of all social sciences at any particular time to maintain a knowledge space of the highest practical dimensionality. This is a much richer standard than bounded recurrence. A final general criterion arises from the fact that a given set of ideas can be discovered in several different ways from several different backgrounds. To continue my example, although the economists are reinventing experimental psychology, they're probably doing it differently, perhaps with more theoretically or with different theoretical arguments, perhaps with more formal, if not necessarily more correct, statistics. Political scientists and some sociologists are, of course, also in the experiment business these days, and they are doing the same kinds of things with still different theoretical assumptions, different experimental protocols, different ways of choosing subjects, and so on. It's clearly better for social science as a whole to have these many different approaches to the same set of issues. I shall call this third one the plurality criterion. We may state it as follows: it's better for social science to have more roots to the same general area in the space of social knowledge than to have fewer. The plurality criterion is a way of embracing the fact that most of social science is rediscovery. Watching the physicists rediscover network analysis has provided many of us with considerable amusement lately, but it is still a good thing to have a new voice in that area. It may be an arrogant and churlish voice, but it's nonetheless enriching our studies. The same is true for my colleague Chicago colleague Steve Levitt's Freakonomics, most of which was warmed over sociology, tarted up as revolutionary discovery. On a larger scale, the more solid parts of cultural studies are reinventing classical anthropology, much to the intense rage of those anthropologists old enough to have read the classics. But it's nonetheless important to have those ideas refurbished for another generation. One of the important reasons that plurality is a virtue is that discoveries that have been cumulated in the traditional view tend to have become routinized and therefore, in effect, forgotten, at least as living ideas. If a given region of the knowledge space is re-entered in plural ways, then we're less likely to lose sight of that region in an active way for a long time, thus fulfilling the bounded recurrence criterion as well. In summary, there are three basic knowledge ideals for the social sciences as a whole: bounded recurrence, plenitude, and plurality. Note also that because no one can know everything, we are unable to stand outside the system of knowledge and know at any given time whether those ideals are being met. However, we can infer how paradigms ought to behave locally if those global criteria are to be maximized. We can't know to what extent we've succeeded, to be sure, but we can at least so act locally that the likelihood of overall success is high. This brings me at last to the formal problem of when a given paradigm ought to start borrowing and from whom. It's obvious that a system in which no evolving paradigm takes any account of others, either for borrowing or avoiding, is a system in which paradigms would end up in more or less Poisson distribution throughout a space of possible paradigms. This would leave large portions of the space untenanted, violating all three criteria. If, by contrast, paradigms obeyed a rule of mutual avoidance, the exact reverse of interdisciplinarity, we would achieve a kind of absolute plenitude with paradigms uniformly spread throughout the space, but it would have rather low plurality. The quality of our knowledge would therefore fail because along with that absolute plenitude would come the inevitable incoherence of each paradigm individually, by the forces pointed out earlier, which would in turn undermine both plenitude itself because of those local failures, and it would also undermine the mutual translatability of knowledge between paradigms, which would be a problem because such translatability is necessary to recover paradigms as they begin to fail in old age. It's therefore certain that as they age, paradigms must borrow. That begins to answer the when question. There's no question that early in the life of a new paradigm, a certain closed-mindedness is optimal. Paradigms develop and grow in part by shutting themselves off from new inputs, even though they may very well have begun with such inputs, as status attainment began with structural equations and historical sociology began with a self-conscious turn to historical questions. But once formed, new collegations actually benefit from shutting their eyes to alternative assumptions, alternative methods, and so on. They develop new insights, elaborate new research programs, develop all the stuff that's success. They have a clarity and logic that are among the great intellectual virtues. It's only when the immediate payoffs from this artificial coherence have been reaped that the forces of incoherence begin to dominate. Demographic forces undermine, clearly defined anomalies begin to become obvious, rash assumptions get relaxed, new substantive areas call for application. Obviously, at this point, the paradigm begins to look outside. Some scholars in a paradigm will look outside earlier than others. The accident of recruitment may have brought in ambitious young people who are hostile to the disciplines of coherence. Some of them may even start borrowing while the original colligation is really still healthy and growing. But where should these practitioners begin to look? Now, to answer this question requires, first of all, that we need to think about whereness in the knowledge world that I'm describing. It seems straightforward, actually, to define closeness in this space in terms of the categories and attributes of knowing that any knowledge lineage has. That lineages of knowing are not subsumable doesn't mean they're not, in some sense, have things in common. They can be regarded as close to one another if their categories and their architectures of knowing contain common elements or are mutually compatible. These adjacencies, taken together, define one important topology for the world of knowledge. Another dimension of closeness is closeness in time. Paradigms are close if they're of similar age, in part because they often tend to be marked by period effects. Modernization left a profound mark on most social science paradigms in the post-war period, whether they were young or old at the moment. Thus, we can also think of closeness in terms of age and period, as well as in the first terms of similarities in architectures of knowing. So there are a number of dimensions of closeness, and the rules of borrowing must follow from them. Now here I have to make a confession. Although I'm about to promulgate some rules for borrowing, I've not yet in fact verified to my own satisfaction that they are the only local rules that will optimize bounded recurrence, plenitude, and plurality for the whole system. I spent too much time getting the preliminaries down, and so I'm just going to have to go with my intuitions. I hope they're good intuitions. We'll see. It seems, first of all, that the form of borrowing commonly called reductionism is problematic. In a system of the kind we're discussing, the reduction of one paradigm to a trivial implication of another is not a good thing. On the contrary, it reduces plurality and may well reduce plenitude. Thus, the demonstration or assertion that, oh, it's all economics, or it's all language, it's one of my favorites. We're linguists, we understand everything. Simply reduces our space of social knowledge, impoverishes it. Of course, saying that reduction is bad is simply another way of stating my empirically based presumption that the entire system of social knowledge is not, at least so far as we can tell, really cumulative. If it were cumulative, reductionism, which is just subsumption under another name, would be a virtue. Put another way, reductionism is the form of borrowing whose purpose is to impose a structure of cumulativity and/or canonicality on the space of social knowledge. The main assertion involved in reduction is that anything that doesn't fit in the reductive account is prima facie unimportant. It's noise, it's error, whatever we want to call it. But in my experience, one scholar's noise and error is another scholar's crucial substance. So for me, reduction is automatically an assault on plenitude and should be ruled out. The current vogues in reductionism tends toward individualism in the guise of rational choice theories and towards biology in the guise of cognitive science. But linguistic reductionism has had its day, certainly, and gender and postmodern reductionism are busy as well. For my part, I wish a pox on all their houses. More ways of thinking about the social world is better, not less. Note, however, that I'm not by any means rejecting the notion of rigor, nor of community-governed bodies of knowledge. I'm just saying that it's not the case that these come in a hierarchical order. It's even fine if there are lineages dedicated to various reductionisms, as long as there are lots of them and they're trying to reduce each other. A second problematic form of borrowing is what we might call affiliationism. As I argued at length in Chaos of Disciplines, many of the attributes of knowledge lineages tend to come in packages. Social science that is realist and positivist tends to be analytic, to focus on the individual level, and to believe in the possibility of transcendent knowledge. While social science that is constructionist and interpretivist tends to be narrative, tends to emphasize emergent phenomena, and to insist on situated knowledge. It should be clear that borrowing from a paradigm that shares most of the qualities of one's own is going to be less challenging and, in the end, less productive than is borrowing from a paradigm that does not share much. Borrowing should involve some serious reach. All the same, one cannot go too far. 20 years ago, I myself rolled out sequence alignment methods for sequence data under the banner of narrative positivism. Now, the conjunction of those two terms seems so disturbing to most of my colleagues that for a long time, neither the narrativists or the positivists would pay any attention at all, even though the methods were of obvious utility to the sociologists of the life course, for example. It took them 15 years to start using them seriously. This suggests that it is best to borrow something quite particular, but then to work it out in careful detail. In the case of narrative positivism, I asked myself the simple question of, what happens to the order of events in standard sociological methods? And the answer at the time was quite simple. It was absolutely ignored. So I asked myself, what would a method look like that began from the idea that we wanted to look at typical sequences of events, not job success at a particular point or job prestige in 1962, as in the celebrated Blau and Duncan book, but whole careers, whole trajectories, whole life courses. I was willing to accept all the other assumptions standard to quantitative social science. Positivistic definition of variables, uniform temporality, independence of cases, and so on. I just wanted to take the order of events seriously, change one thing, and then have a similarly rigorous analysis on that very slightly different foundation. So I went shopping and found the methods, necessary methods in biology and computer science. This borrowing strategy might be called specific translation. The borrowing was focused and served a particular theoretical need. The details of what I borrowed were pretty well worked out, so the job of translation into my own world was at least clear, if not particularly easy. And by making the translation, I brought the other fields in sociology closer together, changing the topology of our social knowledge. A less rewarding type of borrowing, it seems to me, is the wholesale adaptation of new theoretical terminologies. This doesn't renovate a faltering paradigm, it simply renames everything within it. That can provide the appearance of new life, but it does not produce challenging new juxtapositions of ideas and questions. It just changes the names, thereby producing intergenerational confusion, if nothing else, and hence simply contributes to paradigm disillusion. I won't name names here, but this process has been all too common in some parts of social science. I've said little so far about the question not of borrowing, but of redirection. Borrowing is not the only way in which mature and successful generational paradigms relate to one another. Successful paradigms seek new worlds, as I've noted, and to a considerable extent, plenitude in the entire system is dependent on the new directions that they choose. As psychology has departed into biology and renamed large portions of itself as cognitive science, an entire zone of social knowledge that was once rooted in personality psychology of a vaguely psychoanalytic stripe has been considerably depopulated. That the cognitive psychologists have declared the entire area subject to their new tools and enthusiasms, of course, does not mean that interpretive approaches to the personality will long be absent. As I see it, the oversupply of academics in the environing discipline guarantees that somebody else will soon start doing personality psychology. Indeed, in general, I think that plenitude is virtually guaranteed by the enormous oversupply of academics. Young scholars at the edge of all disciplines are pushing into new areas continually, and a paradigm reaching maturity will inevitably take its new directions from these young people. To the extent that a general area of social knowledge has been unserved, there are enormous incentives for young people to go there. I myself am watching the quantitative analysis of historical data being reinvented by young sociologists using event history methods who are doing things that social science historians of my generation did 30 years ago, using regression methods to be sure, but with far greater historical sensitivity. It's much the same watching sociologists invading economics with network methods. The abundance of scholars creates perpetual emigration from paradigm cores, and plenitude and plurality thus seem safely established. I want to close with a simple note. I've spent a scholarly lifetime doing many different kinds of social science, but there are also those who spend a scholarly lifetime maintaining and developing a single paradigm, whether it be young or old or middle-aged. So also some of you have come to this festival to sample many things. Some of you have come to renew commitment to one of them. It takes both kinds of scholars to make social knowledge as a whole. For social knowledge to prosper, it's not necessary that we all tolerate every method here proposed or discussed. Rather, it is necessary that we all tolerate a few methods in addition to our own, and that some of those methods be tolerated by people who tolerate still other methods, which we may not tolerate. If that's the case, then unless there is some grand chasm, traditionally the one labeled quantitative, qualitative, that is unbridged by any toleration, then if that's not there, the whole group is connected by a chain of what the mathematicians call tolerances. If that is true, then the future of social knowledge is as bright as ever.